During its over 160 years of operation, the London Underground has seen many different types of train operate on its 250 miles of track, from the steam engines of the Victorian age right up to the modern air-conditioned, fully automatic S-stock of the 2010s. So in this video, we'll be looking at the trains that have operated on the tube, going line by line, starting with the oldest, the Metropolitan, and ending with the newest in terms of construction, the Jubilee. Now, of course, considering how lengthy a history the tube has, it is sometimes hard to find exact information about when and where trains ran, especially for older lines like the Metropolitan and District, so apologies in advance if I get anything wrong. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. Originally opening in 1863, the Metropolitan line is the oldest on the tube network, and as a result predated the advent of electric multiple units by 30 years. As a result, during most of its time as a separate railway, it mostly relied on steam traction, originally loaned from the Great Western Railway before they received their own rolling stock. Now, I can't possibly go into all the different types of steam trains operated on the Met, but probably one of the most famous ones was this one. Electrification of the Met's routes began in 1900, with the line using a mix of electric multiple units of various classes, as well as a fleet of electric locomotives hauling conventional coaching stock that would be replaced with steam engines beyond certain stations, as the line wasn't fully electrified at the time. When the line was fully absorbed into London transport in 1933, new EMUs designated T-stock started running on the line, due to the incompatibility of the older trains with the rest of LT's subsurface fleet, later joined by F, O, and P stocks. These trains carried on until the early 1960s, when London Transport announced a major modernisation programme for the line, which would include the completion of electrification as far as Amersham and Chesham, with services beyond Rickmansworth still being operated by steam trains until 1961. The new trains, ordered to replace both the locos and EMUs, were the A60 and A62 stock, which entered service in 1961 and enjoyed an incredibly long career on the Metropolitan line, lasting for over 50 years, while also seeing work on the East London line until it closed in 2007. The end for the A stocks on the Met came in 2012, when the new S8 stock began to run on the line, which included revolutionary new features like air conditioning and walk-through carriages, as well as ushering in automatic operation, as part of a modernisation scheme for the four subsurface lines. And thus, there we are today, with the S8 stock continuing to operate Metropolitan line services as arguably one of the best trains on the tube. Like the Met, the District line originally operated with steam locomotives, following its opening in 1868. Electrification of the line began in 1903, following its absorption into what would become UERL. The first electric trains, designated B stock, entered service in 1905, and were joined by several other types of multiple units over the years, including G stock and Q stock. By the way, you see what I mean by this being confusing, right? Just look at all those stock types. The main phase of fleet standardization came in the 1930s, as the O and P stock began operating on the line, followed by the R stock, which came into service in 1949. The O and P stocks running on the Wimbledon to Edgware Road services were the first to be replaced, as they were replaced by C77 stock trains in 1978, with the R stock trains eventually being replaced later in 1980 by D78 stock trains, which were notable for their bizarre single-leaf door configuration, and originally had passengers push buttons to open the doors, but this feature was done away with in the late 1990s. The D78s lasted on the District line right up until the 2010s, when S7 stock trains began to be introduced on the line as part of the Four Lines modernisation project. The first trains to be replaced were the C77s in 2014, with the last D78 running in 2017, and since then all District Line services have been operated by S7 stocks, which is similar to the previously mentioned S8 except for being one car shorter and lacking transverse seats. However, for the D78s, their story doesn't end here. Many former units have seen reprieve as they have been converted for operation on the conventional railway network by the now defunct Viva Rail into Class 230s, which have previously seen service with London North Western, currently with TfW, and in future with GWR. A few were also converted into Class 484s for use on the Island Line, which has always historically had to use old tube stock due to tunnel clearance issues in the Ryde Tunnel. One unit is even still kept by London Underground as a rail adhesion train. Surprisingly, being the grand old age of 20, the D-Stock is the only now retired tube train I can remember using while in service, although I almost certainly used a C-Stock at some point in my early life. Now, of course, the Northern Line is technically formed of two separate railways combined together, but just for easiness, we'll talk about both in tandem. Of course, it is well known that when the first part of today's Northern Line opened in 1890 as the City and South London Railway, it was notable for being the first electric underground railway in the world. The line operated with small electric locomotives with small carriages nicknamed padded cells, which lasted throughout the City and South London's 35 years of life. The other railway opened as the Charing Cross Euston and Hampstead Railway in 1907, and originally used the 1906 gate stock, which was the standard for the original three UERL lines of the 1900s. By the 1920s, it was decided to combine the two lines into what would become today's Northern Line. This resulted in the tunnels of the City and South London having to be enlarged, due to them having a different loading gauge to the Hampstead Railway. Once the works were completed, both the original electric locomotives and 1906 gate stock were replaced by sliding door standard stock trains, which were commonplace across most of the deep level lines in the 1920s and 30s, until they were replaced by the iconic 1938 stock trains, which were later joined by the identical 1949 stock. By the 1970s, the 1959 stock trains began to be transferred to the Northern Line, having been replaced by newer trains on the Piccadilly. However, there weren't quite enough trains to fill the gap, so a few 1938 stocks remained in operation on the Northern until being supplemented by 1972 Mark I stock. However, they would make a comeback for a little bit in 1986 until extra 72 stocks were transferred from the Jubilee line. Eventually, by the mid-1990s, it was becoming apparent that the 1959 stock was getting old and was in dire need of replacing. New trains entered service on the Northern in 1998 in the form of the 1995 stock trains, which eventually brought the line into automatic operation. The last 1959 stock train ran in the year 2000, and was notable for being the last ever train on the tube to operate with a guard. Both the standard and 1938 tube stocks also hold the honour of being the other two types of tube stock to operate on the Island Line, with the standard stock trains, designated Class 485, running from 1967 to 1992, and the 38 stocks, designated Class 483, running from 1989 to 2021. And of course, the 38 stock has become a common sight on heritage runs on the tube network, with me and Daniel, if you remember, accidentally bumping into one on the far reaches of the Metropolitan line. Now, of course, this line didn't technically become a tube line until 1994, but it had already been open for nearly 100 years before that, so we'll still look at it. From its opening in 1898 right up until 1940, it was operated by its own special tube rolling stock, until it was replaced by new rolling stock, later designated Class 487, following the line becoming part of the nationalised BR network. In retrospect, these trains have often been called the 1940 stock. They lasted on the line right up until the early 1990s, when the line had become part of BR's Network South East sector, and it was decided to modernise the Waterloo City with new rolling stock. The new trains entered service in 1993, in the form of the Class 482, which were very similar to the 1992 stock recently delivered to the Central line and survived the line's transfer to London Underground in 1994, although they retained their Network South East liveries until 2006, when they were eventually refurbished into London Underground livery, and have remained in operation on the line ever since. When originally opened in 1900 as the Central London Railway, the line originally operated with electric locomotives hauling conventional gate coaching stock. However, these locomotives were rather problematic, as they had serious vibration issues, which resulted in them being replaced by conventional multiple units only 3 years later, in the form of the 1903 stock, which continued running on the line until the late 1930s, when the standard stock trains entered service on the Central line following the reconstruction of its tunnels. These trains would be the mainstay on the Central line until the early 60s, when a few 1959 stock trains began to operate on the line, until they were transferred to the Piccadilly once the main replacement trains started running. These trains would be the incredibly similar 1962 stock, which finally allowed for the replacement of the aging standard stock by 1964. During this time, part of the Hainault Loop between Woodford and Hainault was designated as a testing area for automatic train operation, in preparation for the opening of the Victoria line, with modified 1960 prototype stock trains first being used before the new 1967 stock trains for the new line began testing on the route, and even ran with passengers from 1968. They were still commonplace on the Hainault shuttle using ATO up until 1984, when they returned to normal Victoria line working. The 1960 stock trains also saw passenger use working on the Epping to Ongar line until its closure in 1994. The line had an interesting history. Despite becoming part of the Underground in 1949, it wasn't electrified until 1957, meaning steam auto trains had to be used. The end for the 1962 stock came in the late 1980s, when the line was due for a signalling upgrade to allow for automatic operation, and it was therefore decided to replace the 62 stocks early. The new trains would come in the form of the 1992 stock, which were based on the 1986 prototype stock, and came into service in 1993, with automation coming later between 1999 and 2001, and they continue to serve the Central line to this very day. The 1962 stock would be retired from the Central line in 1995, although a few still saw use on the Northern line until 1999. However, one unit has been converted into a rail adhesion train for London Underground, and can quite often be seen at West Ruislip Depot if you're lucky, with a 1960 stock train also being used as a track recording train, as often happens with many retired tube stocks, including the previously mentioned 1903 and standard stocks. When originally opened in 1906 as the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, the Bakerloo line, like the Hampstead line, used 1906 gate stock, which were later joined by trains designated 1914 stock for the line's extension to Queen's Park and Willesden Junction, and were later joined by stock jointly operated by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway for the line's further extension to Watford Junction, named Watford Joint Stock. These trains lasted for varying periods of time, but were largely phased out by the 1930s with the arrival of standard stock, and later the 1938 stock, which became the mainstay of the Bakerloo line for several years. This included a brief period in the late 1970s when 1972 Mark II stock trains operated on the line until the Jubilee line was opened in 1979, which took over services between Stanmore and Baker Street, with all the 72 stock trains being moved over to the new line. By 1983, a few 1938 stock trains had been replaced by 1959 stock trains temporarily until more 1972 stock trains became available from the Jubilee and Northern lines, with the last 38 stock running on the Bakerloo in 1985. Since then, the line has continued to be operated by the 72 stock trains, which in 2021 became the oldest trains operating in regular passenger service in Britain, with them being 53 years old at the time of writing. Despite this, no replacement for them seems to be on the horizon, with many people saying the 72 stock might continue operating until as late as the 2040s, when the trains would be over 70 years old. And even today, despite their charm, they are getting a bit tired. Finally, now for my favourite line. Like the Bakerloo and half the Northern, the Piccadilly line in its original form in 1906 as the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton Railway originally operated the UERL standard 1906 stock, which worked on the line for over 20 years until they were replaced by the standard stock trains, with the last original train running in 1929. The standard stock trains operated on the line during the time when the Piccadilly expanded greatly, with extensions opening on both ends of the line, and it was becoming apparent that extra trains were needed for the line, with the 1935 stock prototypes being tested and eventually 1938 stock trains being introduced, followed on by 1949 stocks. Prototypes returned to the Piccadilly line in the 1950s, with the 1956 stock trains being tested in 1957 and 58, leading to the eventual replacement for the standard stocks in the form of the new 1959 stock entering service in 1959, with the last standard stock train being withdrawn in 1964, with the 38 stocks also being slowly phased out due to their age. New trains were eventually ordered, with construction beginning on the extension to Heathrow Airport, which allowed the 1959 stocks to be slowly transferred to the Northern Line between 1975 and 1979, with them being replaced by the new 1973 stock, which has operated on the Piccadilly line ever since. However, this will soon not be the case, as it is planned for the 1973 stock to be phased out from 2026, as they are replaced by the new 2024 stock, which will bring the comforts of the S stock to the deep level lines. So go out and ride the 1973 stock while you can, as they won't be in service in roughly 3 years, and if you couldn't tell, they are my favourite trains currently in operation on the tube, though there are obviously objectively better ones. To avoid repeating myself, I've decided to put these two lines together, as they both have largely operated the same trains since the Circle Line became separate in 1948. When this happened, both Circle Line services as well as Metropolitan Line services between Hammersmith and Barking were largely operated by O and P stock trains until 1970, when the new C69 stock trains entered service, later joined by C77 stock trains originally operated on the District Line. The C stocks operated on both lines for over 40 years, during which the Hammersmith and City line became separate from the Met in 1990 and the Circle line became not a circle in 2009. The end came in 2014 when all C stocks were replaced by the S7 stock trains, which have continued to run on the Circle and H&C to this very day. When originally opened in 1968 as the first entirely new tube line in 50 years, the Victoria line was originally operated with 1967 stock trains, which were famously capable of automatic train operation, making the Victoria line the first fully automatic underground railway in the world. The 67 stock trains served the line faithfully for 40 years until the mid-2000s, when a modernisation programme for the line saw the ageing trains and ATO system replaced by the new 2009 stock trains, as well as improving the line's frequency with up to 30 trains per hour at busy times. The last 1967 stock train ran on the line in 2011, with the 2009 stock trains to this day remaining the newest trains to operate on the deep level network. The 67 stock also holds the distinct honour of being, as far as I'm aware, the only tube carriage you can dine in, which is rather cool, as well as being the only tube train to appear on a coin. When it originally opened in 1979, the Jubilee line was operated using 1972 Mark II stock, inherited from the Bakerloo line. These trains wouldn't last very long, as in 1984 the new 1983 stock began running on the Jubilee line, allowing the 72s to move back to the Bakerloo. These trains were rather similar to the District Line D stock, as they also had single-leaf doors that were controlled by passenger-accessed buttons, as well as having the same seat maquette and basic livery. When plans to extend the line eastwards in the 1990s finally materialised, it was originally planned to retain the relatively young 83 stocks to operate on the extension. However, due to issues with the single-leaf doors making loading and unloading passengers slower, which made them rather inefficient, it was decided to order new trains instead and retire the 1983 stock early. These new trains would enter service in late 1997 as the 1996 stock, which were very similar to the 1995 stock on order for the Northern Line, and are of course very popular today because of this sound. The last 1983 stock would run on the Jubilee line in 1998, in anticipation of the extension opening in 1999, with automatic train operation finally coming to the Jubilee line in 2011, with the 1996 stock continuing to run to this very day. The 1996 stock has also become the film star of tube stocks, as it has featured in several films shot in the abandoned Charing Cross station, and of course famously, a few 1983 stock carriages sit upon the disused Broad Street viaduct as a reminder of its railway heritage. Phew! Well, that was a lot of history, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed me going through the history of the trains that have operated on each individual tube line. Now, of course, I didn't mention the trains that operated on former tube lines, like the Northern City and East London, and of course, I was rather vague on some of the earlier rolling stock, but I mainly did that to ensure this video wasn't a million hours long. Either way, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will see you very soon. Bye-bye!